Hello and welcome. In today's video, I'm going to share with you Ark's 5 coolest creatures. But just before we get into it, make sure to like and subscribe as it really does help the channel. In at number 5 is the Carcharodontosaurus. Now this is definitely a very recent addition to Ark, but it is definitely a creature where you just feel so cool when using it. And also on top of that, it has a very cool and interesting taming method. Also, I would definitely not recommend taming this thing on the island, as they are really rare. I would recommend taming these things on Raasclark. Look around in the highlands biome, you are definitely sure to find one of these things. And once you have, what you're going to do is essentially feed these things dead creatures that you drag towards it. Also, I would recommend wearing ghillie for this, as you do not want to be spotted and the Carcharodontosaurus go into a blood rage. After that, it will have a bar above its head which will go from blue to green. Then you will be able to ride this thing and go around and absolutely decimate everything in the area until this thing is tamed. But if it is dealt enough damage, it will lose effectiveness, so definitely take that into mind. But once you have tamed this thing, you have an absolute beast of a creature. This thing is just so enjoyable to ride on, and its power is just so nice to have. Especially if you've just started playing Ark, this is really a good thing to look forward to. These things are definitely really cool creatures. In at number 4 is the Rock Golem. This thing is significantly older than the Carcharodontosaurus, but in my opinion, it's even cooler. The Rock Golem is literally just a pile of rocks that is ready to attack anything at your command. These things are definitely absolutely powerful beasts, and they are really good if you're doing any kind of turret soaking in a PvP scenario. But in a PvE scenario, these things are just great for decimating absolutely everything in the landscape. But these things aren't an easy task to tame. Actually, it requires you to shoot cannons into its face. But it is well worth it, because look at how quickly it just killed that death worm. Also, when taming one of these things, don't bother feeding it meat. They do not eat meat. Feed it rocks, I think sulfur as well, and I think metal works too. So I would probably recommend feeding these things sulfur. They do not eat meat, they do eat rocks. Once you have this thing tamed, like I've said so many times before, it will absolutely decimate everything in your way. In at number 3 is the Deinonychus. Now this thing is a lot smaller than the other 2 creatures so far on this list, but it is definitely a really cool tame, and it isn't actually too difficult, it just is a bit time consuming. What you'll need to do is find a nest of the Deinonychus on Valguero, and then you'll need to take that egg and then raise it like you would raise any creature from an egg. Then once you have got these things tamed, they are absolutely insane. They can latch onto large creatures and deal a huge amount of bleed damage. They will absolutely tear through creatures, and this works on bosses too, as these things are allowed in boss arenas, and that is absolutely overpowered. Just look at how quickly this thing decimates through all of these other Deinonychuses. Also, the Deinonychus is definitely a pack creature. You are going to want a lot of these things, and they also definitely benefit from the pack buff, which means these things are even more overpowered when in a pack. I know, it is absolutely insane and crazy. Also, these things are very good at traversing landscapes. They can climb any kind of wall or surface and jump around and glide, and they don't even take full damage. So you are never going to run the risk of killing one of these things when falling out of the sky, however that may happen to you, as sometimes full damage can be the bane of pretty much most Ark dinos. In at number 2 is the Rino Ganatha. Now this is a very recent addition to Ark. It's actually the most recent creature that has been added to the game, and you can find it on the island or the lost island in the locations that will appear on the screen now. These things are very rare, so I would definitely recommend, if you're on PC, installing Creature Finder Deluxe to actually find yourself a Rino Ganatha. If you still can't find one, you can obviously use the dino count settings if you're on single player, or use the command destroy wild dinos. Make sure you put wild in that command, otherwise it is going to destroy all of your tamed creatures as well, and you probably don't want that at all. The Rino Ganatha deals immense amounts of damage, and it is a very good, very viable quick flyer. This is actually very reasonable for doing things like metal runs. But you may be wondering how to tame this thing, as this thing is definitely not tamed with the simple knockout tame. Firstly, you need to kill a male Rino Ganatha and take its pheromone. Then you are going to need to get yourself a Bronto and get all of these resources on screen if you want 100% effectiveness. They aren't necessary for the tame though. Then you are going to need to find yourself a female Rino Ganatha. Then you are going to net gun it and deal a lot of damage to it. You want this thing to have a really low amount of health, very similar to how you tame a Reaper, otherwise it is not going to impregnate your dino with the baby Rino Ganatha. Really try and get this thing's health as low as you can. If you do not have the awesome spyglass mod, which I'm using, you can always use a magnifying glass for the same task, as it will show you its health and torpor. Then you need to feed your creature the Rino Ganatha pheromone, and then you need to dismount your creature. Also, don't worry about it attacking you after it's got out of the net. It is simply just going to impregnate your dino and run off, as you can see here. Once that has happened, then you will need to do the cravings, and after a while your creature will fall over and the Rino Ganatha will come out alien style, and you can tame it right then and there. And finally, in at number 1 is the Reaper. Now there is really no creature in Ark cooler than the Reaper. This thing is absolutely insane and by far one of the coolest creatures in Ark, and who wouldn't want a xenomorph to ride around on and absolutely decimate every creature in the landscape. Also, you may notice I'm using a Reaper Queen for the B-roll here. You will have a Reaper King, as you can't tame a Reaper Queen. It's just I had a force-tamed Reaper Queen from a previous experiment of mine. But either way, the Reaper is equipped with a wealth of abilities and only has one weakness, which is light pets, such as something like the Bulb Dog. But once these things are tamed, they are absolutely insane. But you may wonder, how do you actually tame this thing? Well, it is very similar to the Rino Ganatha, except without pheromones. What you're going to need to do is get a Reaper Queen's health really low, then it will have a purple glow, and it will impregnate you, not your dino, you, and then you will have to raise it, and in that phase there is a point where you can gather XP to make your Reaper baby stronger while it is still inside you. Then it is going to pop out of you and probably kill you, so make sure you do have some Reaper Queen pheromones to keep that baby under control, if that's even possible. The best easy Ark tamed. So in at number 7 is the UT. The UT is definitely an essential Ark tame for boss fights, and is also just a great carnivore overall. This thing is relatively simple to tame, but the only real difficulty is this is usually found in very hostile areas of the map. And usually with a UT you will always find a couple of Carcharotauruses, as they always like to follow the UCs, as the UT commands the Carnos to follow it and attack for it. But overall it is just a very simple knockout tame, so it actually isn't too bad. If you are well prepared and you do have yourself the net launcher or a trap, this thing will be a very easy tame. But once you've tamed it, what are you actually going to use it for? Like I said before, this thing does have amazing melee damage, but it also has two special abilities. Firstly, it has the Fear Roar, which will debuff the enemy creature, and also it does have a Courage Roar as well, which will buff your creatures and also debuff the enemy creatures. But just take into mind that the Fear Roar's effects will only work on creatures of a certain size. So look for medium to smaller size creatures. Anything really up to the size of a Argy or a Pteranodon should be fine for the Fear Roar to work. In at number 6 is the Allo. Now this thing is really a great carnivore which pretty much every Ark player should tame, and it is only a little bit easier to actually tame than the UT because it tends to not have as many hostile creatures around it, but this is still a very simple knockout tame that doesn't really require too much prep to be able to tame this thing successfully. Just either bring a next gun or a trap and quite a few tranks. The Allosaurus, when wild, will usually spawn in packs of 3, and in that pack there will be a pack alpha. If you didn't know already, the pack alpha is determined by the level of the actual creature, so the highest level Allo in the pack will become the alpha. Now in my opinion, you should just build a trap to tame this thing, and then you can lure all 3 of the Allosauruses into the trap, and you can tame 3 in one go, giving yourself a nice little pack of Allosauruses just to get you started. And also their saddle isn't unlocked at a very high level as well, so you can definitely tame it in the mid game and fully utilize these things. Also, on top of that, once tamed, these things have a wealth of great abilities, and you can also take advantage of that pack buff which you see in the wild once tamed as well. The pack creature will have an orange glow, and it is essentially just a buffed Allosaurus. It will just be able to deal more damage and have a damage resistance buff. And if you count mate boost as well, your Allosauruses are going to be buffed even more. And also on top of that, they do have the bleed ability when they attack something, which will instantly drain the health of that creature, and I think it's about 25% of a creature's health with 1 bleed damage drain, which to be honest is really insane, and no matter the health of that creature, it will still deal that 25%. So it is a way to really easily kill really tough dinosaurs. And this is an ability that even the Rex doesn't have, so it actually does have an advantage over some bigger carnivores. Speaking of the Rex, in at number 5 is the Rex. Now this thing is definitely a great carnivore for boss fights, not because it deals the most damage or has the most health out of any Ark creature, it's mainly because it is just so balanced in every way. Yes, it does have a great health stat and a great melee stat, but compared to something like a Spino, it is a lot more balanced. Yes, a Spino may do a bit more melee damage than a Rex, but it has far less health, making it a lot less useful. But the thing is, compared to something like the Allo or the UT, the Rex is actually usually a easier tame, as there is not as many hostile creatures around it. Allos usually come in packs, and UTs usually have Carcharodontosaurus around them, whereas Rexes tend to travel alone. The only creatures that you actually find around them is just the general creatures that spawn in the area. You never really tend to find Rexes in packs, which actually makes it easier to tame overall, as you don't have to worry about even more hostile creatures. Then once you do actually have yourself a Rex tamed, this thing is going to be an absolute machine for any of your tasks. The only thing which I'm not really fond of with the Rex is it does tend to get stuck on a lot of the objects in the Ark world, but apart from that, you really can't complain, and it is definitely something special to have an Ark Rex. But keep in mind that its saddle is unlocked in the late 70s, as compared to an Allo, it may not be as accessible early on. In at number 4 is the Spino. Yet again, another carnivore that is easier to tame than the one before it. I assure you the next creature isn't one of these bigger Ark carnivores. Now personally, the reason why I think this is a lot easier to tame than something like the Rex is mainly because it spawns in a much less hostile environment. Yes, the rivers may have piranhas, but the mountains have RGs, other Rexes, scorpions, and sometimes even gigas or the Carcharodontosaurus. So actually, the Spino spawning environment is usually a less hostile place. Also on top of that, I don't think it has as much torpor, so I'm pretty sure it takes less tranks to knock out than something like a Rex. And also it does have less health, so if you do have a reasonable melee weapon or creature, these things are a bit easier to kill if the tame goes completely wrong. And once you have tamed yourself a Spino, you do have yourself a real beast of a creature. It is definitely great to have a Spino, and I usually do definitely have one around. Like the Rex though, these things do tend to get stuck on quite a lot of objects in the Ark world. But compared to something like the Rex, they do have some abilities. Mainly, they have a hydration buff, which is also what the Shadow Main has as well. So when they touch water, they will actually get a damage buff and a damage resistance buff, meaning these things are actual real beasts when in the water. And also, since the TLC update, these things can stand on their hind legs and do even more damage than otherwise. So these things are real beasts of the carnivore world, and they have a wealth of abilities on top of that. Definitely at some point tame yourself a Spino. So in at number 3 is the Deon. Yet another great creature for bosses, and finally not a big carnivore tame. Because yes, carnivores aren't actually the only creatures you need to tame on Ark, even though all of the creatures on this list are carnivores. But either way, the Deon is actually a very simple tame, and a Deon will get you very far in boss progressions, and is also just a great creature if you have just been in a big fight with something like a Giga and your creatures are wounded, as this thing is going to heal your creatures very fast. Yes, not as fast as a snow owl, but on my top 10s, or in this case a top 7, I tend to put creatures that are not behind a paywall except Ark itself, so that is why the Deon is on this list and not the snow owl. The Deon is actually a very simple knockout tame and will tame very quickly, as this thing definitely likes to gobble meat, and if you are using that passive healing ability, you will know how much meat it takes. So in at number 2 is the RG. Now when I was preparing this video, I actually was dictating putting the Pteranodon on this list instead of the RG, but this is mid-game tames, and to be honest, an RG is just far superior than Pteranodon. It simply has to be on this list. Overall, this thing is a very simple knockout tame, only really requiring a trap if it is a high level. But for lower levels, this thing you can just whack a few trank arrows into this thing and then follow it and maybe give it a couple more, and this thing will be out cold. Then after that, just feed it whatever meat you've got. Normal meat, prime meat, mutton, just whatever you have at the time, unless you're specifically taming a max level, and then you probably want to use kibble. But once you do have this thing tamed, you know how much of a beast an RG is. This thing is the best creature. I even rate it higher than the Quetzal for doing metal runs, as it has weight reduction on things like metal, obsidian and crystal. And on top of that, its saddle acts as a portable smithy. So this thing is insane, and if your metal tools break, you can just craft another one right on the fly. Unless you don't have smelted ingots, then you will have to go home for that. But the RG is really a mid-game creature worth taming. And in at number 1 is the Bionics. Now this thing really is the beast of any PvE Ark run, but also the beast of any mid-game Ark player's life. This thing is an absolutely insane creature, and every Ark player does need to tame one of these things at some point, because these are by far one of the most useful creatures you will ever tame in Ark. And on top of that, because this is an easiest tame list, these things aren't actually that difficult to tame, apart from you obviously having to go to the swamp, which is a rubbish biome and every Ark player hates that. Never go to the swamp unless you're taming one of these things. These things are actually a very simple knockout tame, not really requiring a lot of skill or preparation. But just take into mind that these things do eat fish. Don't try and eat the meat and then get your tame killed by a Sarco because you left it overnight. I've made that mistake before. Don't make that mistake at all. But once you do have one of these things tamed, these are by far one of the best creatures for doing cave runs. These things will fit into pretty much any cave. Yes, this doesn't matter as much now with the introduction of cryopods, but these things are still very useful now as they deal a very reasonable amount of melee damage and they have enough health to carry you through any cave. And if you are doing underwater caves, they have a hidden secret ability. By pressing C on your keyboard, if you're on PC, they will have a spin ability, which will actually stun creatures up to the size of a megalodon. And for the underwater caves on the island, this thing is really great for that due to this ability. Maybe don't use it on Moses and plesiosaurs as it doesn't work, but for anything smaller than a megalodon, this thing is insane. But anyway, that was the top 7 Ark easy mid-game tames. I hope you enjoyed, and also did you agree with this list? If you didn't, comment your top 7 down below, and I will see you all later. Bye.